Good evening, fellow Liberals. Bonsoir, chers amis. My name is Marco Mendicino. I'm the Member of Parliament for Eglinton Lawrence. I had the honor of defeating the last Conservative Finance Minister, which sounds like a big deal, except when you remember how lousy Conservatives are at the economy. C'est fantastique d'être ici avec vous à Halifax, que nous reconnaissons est situé sur le territoire traditionnel du peuple Micmac. C'est un honneur d'avoir l'opportunité d'introduire nos deux prochaines bienvenus distingués. Every generation or so, a political campaign comes along and captures the imagination of a nation. It's hard to define, but if politics makes your heart beat a little faster, makes you want to work a little harder, and go knock on some doors, I think you know what I'm talking about. It's a feeling that starts with a voice which speaks to our hearts and minds and offers a vision for the future. Hope and hard work. Yes, we can. Trudeau, Obama, two leaders who expressed vision through words, who turned words into action, and who transformed action into real change. But before the election victories, the bright lights of the press, the big crowds, there was just an idea, nurtured by an individual, surrounded by a small group of family, friends, and believers. And tonight, you'll get to know a little better two believers, not only in the leaders that they love and support, but in the power of positive politics. David Axelrod is a distinguished senior fellow at the University of Chicago Harris School of Public Policy, a 35-year veteran of American politics and journalism, an author, and a frequent contributor on CNN. All in all, David has been part of 150 local, state, and national campaigns, including 2 presidential campaigns for one Barack Hussein Obama. Gerald Butts is a principal advisor to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and has served in this capacity in partnership with Chief of Staff Katie Telford since 2015. Prior to that, Jerry was President and CEO of WWF Canada, where he led initiatives to protect our climate across the country. Of course, many of you will recall before his time in Ottawa and at the WWF, Jerry worked as Principal Secretary to Ontario Premier Dalton McGuinty at Queen's Park, and I'm reminded that all that's left now is a run for City Hall. On a personal level, Jerry is known for his passion for reading and writing, for his alma mater, McGill University, being an unwavering fan of the Habs, and of course, above all, his incredible family. Tonight, we get to know Jerry and David a little more intimately. We'll hear from them about the idealism that helped shape historical campaigns, the challenges of keeping faith in government at a time when people are openly questioning our most trusted institutions, and the path forward so we can continue to build nations which are inclusive, diverse, and confident. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Gerald Butts and David Axelrod.
They love you, man.
Especially those two in the second row there. Stand up, guys.
All right.
These are my kids. You've seen them on such Facebook profiles as mine and Jody's. So David, we could talk about a lot of different things tonight, but I think what people want to hear, other than a few good stories about what it's like to do this kind of work, is why you do this kind of work.
Yeah.
What got you into this business?
Well, first of all, I want to thank you all. I'm actually on a field trip to remind myself what good, smart, principled, accomplished, progressive leadership looks like. So This is a very renewing experience to be with you. You know, I do feel a kinship because we were all part of movements for change that were hopeful, that were positive, that challenged the status quo that needed to be challenged. And that was a wonderful experience. And we share the experience of having marched behind leaders who were charismatic and smart and inspiring, but understood that it's not just about them, that it's about us and what we can do together to make a difference. And that, to me, is so much what politics is all about. It's about the ability to touch the lives of people and the community and your country and move it forward in a positive way. I had that experience, Jerry. If I could just share one element of this, because it makes a larger point. When we fought for the Affordable Care Act in the U.S., it was, I think it's unthinkable to most of the world that it's unthinkable to most of the world. Yes, a high-class crowd here. That we don't have universal health care in the U.S. But when President Obama decided that he was going to take that on, you know, I was his political advisor, and you can appreciate this. 7 presidents had tried, 7 presidents had failed. I talked to him about the political calculus of doing it, and he said to me, well, what are we supposed to do, put our approval rating on the shelf and admire it for 8 years, or are we supposed to draw down on it to do something to make a difference in the life of the country? And of course, that's why I loved working for him. I always say I liked him so much because he listened to me so little. But the night that the Affordable Care Act passed, I went into my office in the White House as the final votes were coming in, and I closed the door, and I sobbed. I just broke down, and I cried. And I cried in part because I have a child with a chronic illness, epilepsy. When she was a child, she started seizing at 7 months old. I was a young newspaper reporter. Her seizures, we couldn't get them stopped for 18 years. But at that time, I was making a modest salary, and her insurance wouldn't cover the treatments she needed or the medications, and we almost went bankrupt. And I cried because I realized that there were other families that wouldn't have to go through what my family had gone through. And I went and I found the president, and I said, I want to thank you on behalf of all those families who won't have to go through the terror and the anxiety that my family went through. And he just put his hand on my shoulder and he said, that's why we do the work. Now that's a very simple statement, but it's so profound and so true. And so my message to all of you is, let us not forget why we do the work. It is not about, I know this is probably heresy at a party convention, but it's not just about hoisting the flag of your party. It's not just about who's up and who's down. It's about what you do with the opportunity. And you guys have done some spectacular work, whether it's tax relief for working families or on child care or on pensions and the whole range of things that you've worked on. And I know, because I've been through it, how hard that can be. And I know that there are times that are, there are down times in politics when the media meme isn't friendly and the wind is in your face. And you got to work your way through that. And the way to work your way through that is just remember why we do the work. Why we do the work. So I'm in this because that work is so rewarding, so important. And I suspect that's why so many people are here today.
Yeah, I think, from my perspective, I grew up in a coal mining town about 5 hours from here, down that Glace Bay. Anybody in you know, their grandfather, those two kids there, I'll be shockingly 47 years old in July. And when my dad was 47, he was entering year 26 of mining coal. And he had about 15 more years to go before he retired. And I think the countries that create circumstances where people like you and me, and I want to ask you about your childhood too and how you got involved in this, can grow up, can be born where we're born and grow up to do things like this are really precious and they're really rare. And if we've learned anything over the past few years in global politics, they can also be assailed.
Yes.
And they need to be defended and replenished, and they need new ideas all the time. But most of all, they need to stay focused on making sure that everybody can make the most of their lives, and that's what politics is all about.
Absolutely, and I want to focus on that. But you know my story, so you know that my father was an immigrant from Eastern Europe and came over to the States. He did actually pass through Canada, and he settled in the Bronx. He was 12 years old when he came, and one of the most moving experiences I had when I was working for President Obama was we were there for bilateral meetings in Russia, and I stood in the line of dignitaries in Red Square, and the band, the Army band, was playing our national anthem. I'm always moved to hear the national anthem on foreign soil, but this was particularly meaningful because it was the eve of what would have been my father's 99th birthday. And I stood there and I thought about the fact that he and his family fled all those years ago, and they came to the United States because they had hope. It represented hope for the future, and that hope was realized. And here I was, back in Eastern Europe as the senior advisor to the President of the United States. And I was so moved by that, and whatever flaws that there are in my country, I'm sure you feel the same way. I mean, we're always trying to perfect our unions, and but there's so much to fight for. And I agree with you. Fundamentally, it's that principle that people ought to be able to make the most of their lives, and that's really important today because technology is roiling our societies. It is creating enormous opportunity for those who are well positioned to take advantage of it, and it is disrupting a lot of lives. And the challenge for us who believe in liberal democracy and who believe in this principle of opportunity is to develop policies and approaches that help people cross that divide, that make sure that opportunity isn't a closely held asset. And if we don't do that, then I think that we open the door to the kinds of illiberal movements that we're beginning to see in my country, but in many countries.
Yeah, I mean, anybody who spends a lot of time on social media in this country has certainly seen a market increase in that kind of activity here as well. David and I met many, many years ago I was a very young staffer in Dalton McGuinty's office as we were preparing for the 2003 election. And the internal analysis of what had happened in the 1999 election when the McGuinty team lost to, sorry, the Prime Minister's giving me mic holding advice here. And of course he's right.
Good to have good staff.
Exactly. Anyway, I was saying how we met. I think I was 27 years old, and it was really my first gig in elected politics. And I didn't really know a lot about a lot. I knew enough to know what I didn't know, I think.
That's the first step, by the way.
That is always the first step, yes. And you were sort of an acquisition, a strategic acquisition, whether you knew it or not, in an arms race.
Yeah.
That they felt that Mike Murphy, who was a pretty, and I know a friend of yours, a
Yes.
relatively notorious Republican consultant, had been acquired by the Harris team to come up and teach Canadians what attack ad campaigns were all about.
Yes, not the best export America has ever.
No, not at all. And I think that even if it were just for a internal confidence, people felt they needed someone who could do the same thing. But for those of us who got involved for the reasons that I think a lot of the people in this room got involved, and this may be the youngest political convention in the history of Canada, which is
Yes,
something
which-
I know the Prime Minister
Yes,
is
yeah.
incredibly proud of.
Yeah, and I'm told as we spoke that half the people here had never attended a convention
Correct.
before, and that's a wonderful
It's
sign.
amazing. It's a great
Yeah.
sign.
That's the half.
Yeah. What I remember most about you at that moment was your advice was the opposite of what I thought it was going to be. It was, you don't have to do politics that way. That there is a way to be tough in the way that you contrast yourself and your plan with your opponents, but you can win with concrete measures and a positive message, which in some ways, you can trace right to the 2015 campaign that Katie Telford and I ran, that there were lots and lots of people, both in the public domain and privately, who were encouraging, because there was such a distemper toward Prime Minister Harper in particular, who were encouraging a very conventional attack ad campaign. And those voices got louder as the campaign approached and the public polls showed us faltering. But, you know, one of the best things, you're only as good as your candidate, right? You really are. And there are a lot of people around.
I'm sure he says that behind your back as well.
He knows I do. You're only as good as your candidate. And it's in moments like that where you find out what the person you're devoting all of this time and effort and work and time away from your families, what they're worth. And it's amazing when they do the right thing.
Yeah, well, listen, I think that every campaign, successful campaign, when they're at their best, are built around the authentic person leading, and they also speak to the real life concerns that people have, and that was true in that campaign. It's true certainly in 2015 here. It was true in our campaigns. I think, you know, people want to know that you're authentically connected with them, their lives, and that you view this not as a power grab, but as an opportunity to get things done that might help them. That is not to say that campaigns should ignore their opponents. It's not to say, you know, in my view, campaigns are choices. And particularly, I mean, you're entering a re-election, and you're in the middle of a project here, a progressive project that's been very productive, but has many pages to turn. There are going to be other parties who charted or offer a different path. I think it's important that people know what the choices are,
Yeah.
and what path they're choosing. And it would be derelict, as it would have been for us in 2012 in the US, not to make sure that people understood what the choices were. That is not to say that the politics of destruction are the way to go, that personal attacks, caustic attacks, politics, frankly, that we've seen too much of in the U.S. Of late, is the way to go either.
So let me ask you a question on that front, because this is in some ways a bit of a parlor game for people involved in politics. What in your
Who are
view,
always involved in parlor games.
yeah, exactly. What in your view constitutes an attack ad? What crosses the line?
Well, look, I mean, anytime you mention the opposition party or an opponent, someone's going to call it an attack ad. I consider it ads that are personal in nature, that are sort of extraneous in some ways, that try and plumb, resentment in ways that, we've seen that can be effective. I don't favor that. What I favor is, if you're going to engage on a factual basis and engage on a contrast that, I look at this party and I think that it is a party that is genuinely engaged in this project of trying to figure out how to strengthen the middle class and working families and expand opportunity in a time of revolutionary changes in our economy. That is a really worthy project, and every other campaign needs to be held up against that. And people need to understand what they're offering is. I also think that when, there are dark forces in our politics now, and sometimes they arrive in stealthy ways.
Yeah.
That's part of what social media has allowed.
That was sort of the next question I was going to ask you, David, is how do you think the social media environment has changed this great democratic endeavor we're all here to support?
Look, I think social media, we've experienced the upside of it, both of us have, in the ability to mobilize people, to organize people. In our election, we wouldn't have been able to raise the resources without it. And then, in 2012, when we refined techniques, because technology is always changing, it did make it easier to understand who the electorate was. So there was, you want to be efficient in campaigns. You don't want to talk to people who are absolutely going to vote and are going to vote for you. You don't want to waste time and resources because you don't need to, nor do you want to talk to people who absolutely aren't. You want to focus on those people who are available to you but aren't necessarily either motivated to vote or aren't persuaded that they're going to vote for you yet. And you want to give them information that's going to motivate them. And all of that technology allows, social media allows. I still don't think that it's a substitute for good old-fashioned shoe leather. And one of the things is it's made grassroots campaigning more effective because you know what doors you should knock on and you have some sense of what information they want. But I don't think that person-to-person contact is a thing of the past. I think it's still very, very important.
Well, I think it's amen to that.
I'm glad you feel that way because you're the guys who are going to have to knock on doors.
Exactly. Well, I also think that in some ways, and it will go in unpredictable directions. I think we all know that. But in some ways, it has facilitated better conversations when they happen face to face in the right circumstances. Yes. I'm confident, not that these records are kept. It's not baseball. I want to ask you a baseball question. Going back to time immemorial, but I'm confident that we knocked on more doors in this country in the last campaign. Yes. By far than any other campaign in the history of the country.
I think we probably did as well. And that's so important because, as I said earlier, I mean, it's important, Yes We Can was a tagline, a slogan that we embraced in Senator Obama's campaign for the U.S. Senate. And I liked it so much because it was positive. It was about what we could do, not what we can't do. And it was about we and not the candidate, because it's what we do. And the more that people are involved and the more people get that face-to-face contact, the better. Now, it's also true that there are nefarious applications of social media that have become more evident. And I think that's something we're going to have to be alert to, and you're going to face this in your campaign. This will be, you know, obviously Hillary Clinton faced it in her campaign. Social media can be used to mine resentments and target people in ways that are really insidious. Obviously, the Russians are hard at work on this project. And, you know, one of the things campaigns are going to have to do is to be very alert to it and expose it and make sure that people know that there's this thing going on behind the scenes that is negative and insidious and dangerous.
Yeah. Going back a little bit to your time in the White House.
Yes.
As anyone who's been in jobs like this know, it's you should never get too high or too low on any given day. How did you How did you deal with that ebb and flow personally, and as a leader of a team within the White House? How did you?
Well, you know,
How'd
we
you keep
came at a
people up when
particularly
things were
difficult time because of the financial crisis. I mean, we literally, I mean, you know, I remember meeting with President-elect Obama and his economic team in mid-December of 2016. I'm sorry, 2008. And each of the economic advisors gave their report on where the country was. Each report was worse than the last. And by the time they got done, Obama said, well, I guess it's too late to ask for a recount. So we better figure out what we're going to do. And by the way, that was one way we got through, was because every time we were at a low point, he was the guy who picked up the team.
Right.
And because he had this longer vision of what we were about, and that was really important. But you mentioned baseball before, and it's actually applicable. You know, I did a piece a few years ago for the New Yorker magazine about the Chicago Cubs as they were preparing for their march to their first title in 108 years. And yes, thank you.
Hey, the second biggest Cubs fan in this room is a man by the name of Bruce Young, who was our campaign co-chair in British Columbia last election, and I'm sure you just made him the happiest man in the room.
Well, there's a man with a lot of tolerance. But you know, it struck me as I was talking to the manager and all the brass of the Cubs and the players that these long baseball seasons are a little like a campaign and a little like governance, in that you're doing these things in the full view of millions of people, all of whom think they know how to do it better than you, and are all very generous with their advice. And you inevitably have high moments and low moments. You know, I'll always remember there was we thought we were gaining some momentum in 2010, and then there was this oil leak in the Gulf of Mexico, right. And it was a terrible disaster. It wasn't easily solved. There wasn't a lot of work on how to plug a leak a mile under the surface, and this became like a huge media. Somehow, we didn't have the technology to stop the leak, but there was the technology to get a camera a mile down so people could see the leak. And it was on cable television constantly, and there was this sense that this was, you know, a referendum on the competence of the government, and you know, people were calling it Obama's Katrina. This was going to be the decisive event of the campaign. Well, we ultimately solved it, and in 2012, I don't think it came up once. And it's an important lesson, because the fact is, you have setbacks, and because of the nature of our modern media environment and the nature of politics, people will dwell on it and say, this is going to be decisive, this is going to be important. And very few of these things end up being decisive. Many of them aren't even remembered. But in the moment, they seem bigger than they are. And the most important thing, and this was true going through the baseball season, is you're going to have losing streaks. and people are going to start writing, you know, whether you're approaching things the right way and are they really title worthy and so on. You've got to play through that and understand that this is a long journey and there are going to be ups and downs. And as long as you know who you are and what you're trying to do, and that's particularly important in government because you can have your plan, but there are things that are always going to intrude on it. Tragedies, setbacks, and you have to keep your composure. And we tried to stress that in the White House.
Yeah, I think that's one of the thing I'd pick up on what you said is you have to have a long-term goal. And it's a business that's driven by the news cycle in some ways. It's a business that's driven by short-term concerns. But the way to get through those is to have a goal that doesn't recede, right?
Yeah.
And
you know, Rahm Emanuel was our chief of staff for the first 2 years. Rahm is a very energetic guy.
yes, we spent some time with him in Chicago.
And I remember him coming. We'd have these bad days, and he'd come back to his office, and he was like, "How can he be so calm?" You know, it's like it was maddening to him. But the fact is that Obama had a great facility for saying, "Look, we're playing a long game here. We're not going to win or lose an election today."
Yeah.
You know, and it's
You know,
a great climate.
I had an aunt here growing up who was a huge force in my life, force for good, who really taught me how to read and write. And she used to say that and she said this to me about politics when I got involved in politics. She said there are two kinds of people in politics, and I think this is true of life in general. There are people who want to be something,
Yes.
and there are people who want to do something. And the people who want to do something, like that young man right there, like the president that you had the honor of serving, really need to be supported and defended.
Yes. Look, I think I couldn't agree more. You know, I first met Barack Obama in 1991, and he had just come back from law school. Some woman named Betty Lou Saltzman, is kind of a doyen of liberal politics in Chicago, called and said, "I want you to meet this young man." And I said, "Well, I'm happy to meet anybody you want, but why?" She said, "Well, I know this is going to sound strange, but I think he could be the first African-American president of the United States, 1991. So when I go to the track, I take Betty Lou with me now. But I went and I had lunch with Obama, and this is apropos to your point. The thing I remember most of all was thinking, here was a guy who was the first African-American president of the Harvard Law Review. He could have written his ticket at any corporation and any law firm in America and set himself up for life. And instead, he had come back to Chicago to run a voter registration drive and practice civil rights law in a small firm and teach. And as he talked to me, he said, I think I want a career in public service. He said, I want to do something that's larger than myself. And I walked away with that very thought, because my experience in politics is just as you and your aunt described it, which is there are two cohorts. There's the group of people who run for public office because they want to be something, and that's frankly a larger cohort. And then there's this smaller and more admirable cohort of people who run because they want to do something, and almost invariably those are the people who end up having the real impact.
What? I agree.
I just restated your point, but it went over so well, I thought I'd say it again.
That's the wisdom of crowds, David. Tell us something odd about being in the White House and working for the President of the United States. Did you ever have, and I'm sure you did, a moment where you said, I can't believe that just happened?
Oh my God, every day. But I'll tell you what, there was one day that I'll always remember. Early in the administration, we had all these incredibly difficult issues to decide, but one was what we should do about the American auto industry, and this was not insignificant to you up here in Canada.
Of course.
And whether or not we should intervene to keep GM and Chrysler from collapsing. And there was a lot of argument on both sides, and the polling was very negative on it, even in Michigan.
I believe your eventual opponent wrote a helpful op-ed about that.
Yes, he did. He did, but it was a serious decision, and the president had a task force. Anyway, the day he had to make this decision, we were going to meet in the Oval, and the meeting got started late because the North Koreans were up to something, and he had a national security meeting that went over long. And then we met for 45 minutes, and he said, I can't make this decision in 45 minutes. We're going to reconvene tonight. He went on to do a national town hall on the state of the economy. And then he had a meeting on Afghanistan and a meeting on Iraq. And then we reconvened and spent 2 hours talking about the auto decision. And it was a very emotional and fraught discussion because we knew what we wanted to do, but it had to be a sensible decision. And he made his decision. And I went in my office and I collapsed, right?
Yeah, because that, unlike the circumstance you were describing earlier,
right.
You could have just won or lost the election that day.
Exactly. But I mean, I was just the pace of the day was, and as soon as I sat down, the phone rang, and it was Ram, and he said, "Get my office. Fargo's underwater. There's a flood. We have to do something." And I thought, my God, this is an episode of The West Wing.
Yeah.
This isn't real life. But that was, it was the most stimulating job I ever had, but it was exacting. I will tell you one thing, though, that I learned being in the White House, which is how hard it is to be in that building and keep in touch with what was actually going on in the country. I felt like I was in a submarine, and I was looking at America through a periscope. And the way the president dealt with it was he insisted on, he asked for 10 letters a day. He got tens of thousands of letters a day. He asked for 10, and he read them. He often responded to them with notes of his own, or he'd call people. And that was his way of trying to tether. I mean, he'd travel, but when you travel as President of the United States, the interactions are limited. So I found that maybe the most difficult part of the job was that I was used to being out and about. I was from the middle of the country. And it's easy to get lost in the sort of echo chamber of Washington if you're not careful.
Well, and it's also easy to forget how difficult it is to make what you're doing in Ottawa or Washington mean something
Absolutely.
To regular people.
Well, I think this is super important, especially given the mission that you guys are committing to yourselves here. The thing about governing is that you deal with so much. You're doing so much, and then you're dealing with all the incoming. And the communications pipeline is narrow. So there are only so many things that you can communicate. And you think that people know what you've done. And you get tired of saying these things. And then you have to realize, you know what, most people aren't, they're living their lives. They're not consumed by politics. They're not hanging on every word. That was a hard realization.
Yeah. Well, they hire you to be consumed with politics.
Right.
So they don't have to.
But it is important to understand what the things are that are most important to communicate and make sure that you're communicating them consistently. I think if there was any failing that I personally had in the 2 years that I was, the first 2 years at the White House, it was that we had so much going on that we didn't tell the larger story of what we were about and where we were going. And you always have to be able to tell that story, and you can't get distracted by all of the other things that you have to deal with. You have to elevate those things that support the story and that animate the story, and not just become a series of disjointed announcements.
We are almost running out of time. So I want to give you an opportunity to give us your best advice. We are an incumbent government trying to do big things well. We expect to face a very aggressive opponent in the next election.
Yes.
What would you do if you were us?
Well, I mean, in a sense, I'm going to sum up what I've already said, but the first is, I'd start with what I just said. You're doing, and kudos to you, Mr. Prime Minister, for doing it, but you are doing real, tangible things that they haven't transformed people's lives, but over time they're going to make a huge difference, whether it's the child care issue or training and skills is another, which I think is going to become one of the most important issues of our time. And just there's a series of things that you're doing that are meaningful in people's lives. One of the reasons the sort of populist, nationalist forces have flourished in places is because there was a sense that the status quo was not serving people and that they were being ignored and that their concerns weren't the concerns of the people who were governing. That's plainly not the case here, but they won't know it unless you communicate it. And there'll be those who spend a lot of money and a lot of effort trying to persuade them otherwise. So focusing is very, very important. The second is the one I mentioned earlier about, I appreciate, because I was part of a campaign like it, how positive your campaign was in 2015, how inspiring and uplifting it was, because people get tired of this grinding, negative politics. I thoroughly understand it. And I associate myself with that. But the world is a tough, competitive place. So, and power does not, it doesn't, people will do anything to recapture it. Particularly opponents who don't feel a stake in government, who don't feel a stake in the notion of a society that's unified.
Yeah.
And I mean, they're not tethered by principles that might tether us.
Right.
So you have to be prepared to push back hard. And I don't mean in the way they would, but what did Lincoln say? If they don't stop telling lies about us, we're going to have to start telling the truth about them. So I think that's very important.
Okay, so I'm going to get roasted by all of these kind people who, believe it or not, pay attention to U.S. politics from time to time. What's going to happen in the midterms?
Wow. Don't you guys have enough to do in this country? I think if you look at all the elections that have taken place since November of 2016 in the U.S., there's been a consistent pattern. That pattern has been inflated Democratic turnout and enthusiasm, relatively flat Republican turnout and enthusiasm, huge outpouring of participation and candidacies by women. Women are going to be a big story in 2018. And I just came, I'm on the board. I run an Institute of Politics at the University of Chicago. I'm on the board of one at Harvard. I just was at Harvard. We were exposed to some polling of millennials. And the polling, what came screaming through was, there was a period of time when young people said, well, politics doesn't matter. I think there was a frustration after 2008 because of the obstacles that were placed in our way. And there was a sense of maybe elections don't matter as much as we thought. That's not true anymore. Young people understand that elections matter. And I think that, so all that put together is, I think that it is more likely than not that Democrats win control of the House of Representatives back. I mean, I'm just telling you this, you and me. I'm not saying it publicly. And you know, the Senate is much tougher the way our system works. It just so happens that there are, I think, 26 Democrats seats at stake and 9 Republican seats. 10 of the seats that are at stake are in states that Trump has had won by some margin. The Republicans have a 2-vote lead in the Senate. It would take a considerable wave to overcome that, though I wouldn't rule that out. So, you know, from a Democratic perspective, I would be positive about the fall, but, you know, Donald Trump is a unique figure in our politics.
Can you believe we had a conversation?
And you know, I don't know that there's any limit to what he would do to try and win that election. And so I think people are going to have to be vigilant and not assume too much.
You know, David, this was a 40-minute conversation.
This what?
Was a 40-minute conversation.
Yes.
And Donald Trump came up at minute 38.
Yeah. Let me just say, I don't know the man that well, but I think he'd be bitterly resentful about that. But look, you know, let me finish where I began. I think first and foremost, Canadians have a stake in what happens in your politics and in the success of this project. But we're at a time in the world where liberal democracies are under assault, and some of it is coming from Moscow and some of it is coming from other places. But we need those shining examples to succeed. It's important because, for the reason that we spoke earlier, because of your dad, because of mine, because we want to hand to our children that legacy. So, you know, I'm rooting very hard for you. And I have, seeing this group, I have some confidence as I leave here that I'm on the winning team here.
Excellent. My son stood up, David. One more thing before we go. I know you're a legendary Chicago Cubs fan, but I wanted to give you a little token of appreciation from the Prime Minister's hometown. They're gone, so they're not a threat anymore to the Cubs.
Yeah. So I have to tell you this. I know we're over time, but I'll tell you the exact moment when I thought, yes, Barack Obama could get elected president. We were at a fundraiser in Boston, and the Red Sox were playing the Yankees, the hated Yankees, and it was a big series. And Obama came to the hall, and there were 5,000 people waiting, and as he was in the green room, the organizer gave him a Red Sox cap. And he's a huge Chicago White Sox fan. And Obama looked at that and said, there's not a way in the world I'm going to wear that thing. But then he goes out and he sees the crowd and he says, you know, they asked me to wear a Red Sox cap, and I had to tell them they had the wrong colored socks. And I'm like, what are you doing? And everybody booed. And he said, but I'll tell you this, when you're playing the Yankees, I'm a Red Sox fan. And I thought, that was slick. That was slick. So thank you. I'm not going to put this on, but I appreciate it. I will wear it in private.
Thank you, sir.